Thank you for joining us. My name is Mark. I'm a bookseller here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. You can also see our in-person events listed there as well if you are in the Portland area. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or sign up for our weekly events email at powells.com. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome Gabriela Alemán in conversation with Rodrigo Fuentes. Gabriela Alemán is based in Quito, Ecuador, and has played professional basketball in Switzerland and Paraguay, and has worked as a waitress, administrator, translator, radio scriptwriter, and film studies professor. And if that isn't the best first line of anyone's bio that you've ever heard, I don't know what is. It's just so good. Her literary honors include a Guggenheim Fellowship. She was named as a member of Bogota 39, a 2007 selection of the most important up-and-coming writers in Latin America. And she has won several prizes for her criticism, as well as her fiction. She is with us this afternoon in honor of her new collection of stories, which is called Family Album. Zachary Lazar, author of Vengeance, says, Gabriela Alemán writes beautiful, sly, enigmatic stories originating in a rogues gallery of real-life legends, including El Santo and John Wayne Bobbitt, as well as lesser-known and invented souls, all of them struggling against the silent, or is it hostile, backdrop of Ecuador's past and present. Family Album is a mordantly funny and haunting collection. And Stefan Sebastian Herrera, the 2021 Penn Emerging Voices Fellow, says, reading Aleman is like trying to touch the seabed with your toes. The depths of her craft are seemingly endless, which is a great sentence. Joining Gabriella in conversation, we are delighted to welcome Rodrigo Fuentes. He is the author of Trout, Belly Up, and won the Caratula Central American Short Story Prize in 2014. He teaches at the College of Holy Cross in Massachusetts and splits his time between there and his native Guatemala. Tonight's event will also include a Q&A. Please use the Q&A button close to that chat button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. If someone has typed a question that you like and you'd like to know the answer to, please give it a thumbs up. You can upvote that question, put it to the top of the list. That's all I have to say. So please, wherever you are, put your hands together and welcome Gabriela Alemán and Rodrigo Fuentes.
Well, hola, Gabriela. Hi, it's such a pleasure, such a joy to be here speaking with you, and especially speaking about this great book, Family Album. I know we've had conversations about it in the past through email, in person, and now we find ourselves on Zoom, but it's always a pleasure. And I actually would just kind of like to dive into the questions that I've had. As I was reading, of course, the translation by Dick Cluster and Mary Ellen Fiewiger, I had read this book in Spanish. I read it recently in English. And as often happens with translations, with good translations, you get access to this world, which seems a new world, despite the fact that I was acquainted with it. And because of that, since we're starting afresh, so to speak, I would like to start with the title. The title is Family Album. And one thing I noticed is that these stories are often of characters that are establishing kind of unexpected relationships with unexpected people. Sometimes it's a foreigner connecting with an Ecuadorian near the Galápagos. Sometimes it's two random men kind of randomly hitting it off in a laundromat. And there's definitely an interest in relations, but not necessarily or not explicitly family relationships. So that made me wonder, what family or what kinds of families is a book title referring to, Family Album?
Good afternoon, Rodrigo. It's a great pleasure to be speaking with you tonight. First of all, I'd like to thank Powell Books. At this point in my life, Powell's become a myth. Every time I mention it, people tell me stories about it. People who have been there, people who imagine to go there. So thanks for having organized this. It is a strange sensation to read a book that you've written in another language. And it brings things out that probably at the time that I was writing it didn't seem obvious to me, but in another language, it seems like in some way someone else wrote it. And also it's just coming out in English, but the book was published in 2010 in Peru, then it was published in 2011 in Colombia, and then it was published in 2012 in Ecuador. And some years later, it was published in Puerto Rico. So it's had these winding, it's taken some winding roads to wind up in English, published by City Lights, which also makes me very happy. The first thing that I thought when you were talking about this family album, Rodrigo, is I love secondhand stores. I love flea markets. And more than once I found, one time actually, like directly, I found the luggage. It was a leather bag. It was probably from the 1920s or 30s. And someone had given it to this flea market, or maybe someone had found it in the garbage and taken it to the flea market. But when I opened it up, it was the life of a person, years of a life of a person, 20, 30, 40, 50 years of marriages, of deaths, of children, of marriages, of divorces. And it wound up in my hands, a total stranger, someone who spoke in a different language, because I found this in a flea market in France. And behind these photographs, some of the photographs, there were notes written in Arabic. So from what I saw, it was somebody who had been in Algeria. And there was some connection with France. There was some connection with a woman from France, because there were other scribbled notes in French. And it got me to thinking about this book and about something that happens in this book. And there's a lot of strangers who meet and in some ways become family immediately, or what one would think a family member, or some of the characteristics of a family member, someone you trust, someone you would look for help if you're in a problem, someone who you would confide in because you know that you will not be betrayed. And sometimes that's not the case, actually. Sometimes I think when you're at your most vulnerable, when you're alone, when you're far away, when you're living in a different country, you're expressing yourself through a different language, you become devoid of all these masks and walls we put between each other when we communicate. And I find that sometimes with total strangers who you think you'll never see again in your life, you have a more direct communication with. You're more open to whatever experience you're going to have at that moment. And there's a number of those relationships, like you were mentioning, Rodrigo. So that would be one of the things that's persistent throughout the book. But then there's also the other one, that it's a family album of the Ecuadorian family in some ways. So there's a number of things that happen in this book and the different stories that pertain to the realm of reality. Most of the stories, or all of the stories, at some point connect with something that did happen in Ecuador. Not necessarily with the history that goes into textbooks, but the small histories that circulate through word of mouth, through gossip, through folklore, through pop culture, things that are handed down and at some point are lost. When I started writing, for example, about the story of the Biddy basketball championship in upstate New York in 1967, this is something that actually happened. Ecuador was runner-up to the World Championship. And when I started telling people about this, because first of all, I wrote a journalistic piece for a magazine, and everybody I'd see, I'd run into the street and tell them, did you know that Ecuador won the silver medal in 1967 for children's basketball? And they'd look at me with a blank expression in their face and no, why would Ecuador win a basketball championship? You're nuts. That didn't happen ever. And these are stories that, if they're not told through generations, are lost. And in some ways, I found that these stories, these small stories, these stories that have to do in some ways with the underbelly of what one would consider what one should be proud of, speak more about Ecuador than these other stories about military courage or independence or fights or things that we should be proud of, when in most cases the things that we are proud of as nations involve violence in many ways. So that's the long answer to your question.
No, a long and great answer. It's interesting that you mentioned these relationships, not necessarily of loyalty, but of closeness between family members or those that we bring into whatever family we decide to call family, right? But I mentioned this because one of the things that intrigued me as I was reading the book this time was that there are several fake or kind of counterfeit characters in the book, right? There's a baroness of I think summer vacation who arrives in Guayaquil with fake letters of recommendation and a dubious past, right? There's Max in the first story in Baptism, who desperately wants to scuba dive, but is hiding something about himself that the narrator doesn't become aware of till the end of the story. And you have the story like Marriage, where the narrator finds out that her husband, who she considered kind of a loser, has been leading this intense, extravagant double life all along, right? So I was wondering, what is it about these kind of fake or counterfeit characters and stories that interested you?
I really find it curious that we lead these lives with the people we meet, and we believe that we know all of their lives just by encountering them, by speaking to them, by having some sort of connection. And when you really dive into other people's worlds, you haven't even scraped the surface, because everybody holds within themselves universes. They have relationships with other people. They have a past, they have dreams, they have secrets they would not like to be known. And that shadow part of a person's life, I think, is bigger than what we present to the world. And I find that literature can explore that part in a way that's much more intense and much more nuanced than any other, I think, more than film, more than painting, more than any of the other arts, because you're dealing with words, and the world is constructed upon words. So you can, in some ways, see the layers that we create and that we show the outside world, and all these layers that we keep to ourselves. And all of this conforms a human being. And I mean, the stories are very short. They're not more than 8-10 pages long, but I try to pack as much of this dual nature, of these layers of people, of this representation of a nation in a person, in all of these stories. And like I said before, I'm more interested in telling the shadow instead of talking about the light. And also in terms of the nation, which continuously, if you read throughout the book, at some point when I published this book in Colombia, there was a review written that it was a novel and that it wasn't a collection of short stories, because all the stories dealt with Ecuador, and in some ways, some of the characters, and you just mentioned this idea of the counterfeit, this idea travels throughout the stories. So in some ways, you could think of it as chapters in a book about Ecuador, or just encapsulated stories that work by themselves.
No, that's interesting to hear you say that, because, or to focus both on kind of human nature and the literary possibilities of this human nature, let's say, or the possibilities of literature more broadly, because I think this kind of double or focus on doubles and kind of false appearances also seems to be in line with your interest with the detective fiction genre. And I'm thinking, of course, of your novel, Poso Wells, which was also published by City Lights in translation a couple of years ago. And so I was wondering, what is your relationship with the detective fiction genre in general? And do you see elements of that kind of at work in these stories?
I enjoy reading detective fiction, but I think more than than a reference directly to detective fiction. I was playing with some of the tropes that are involved in detective fiction, but mostly with the idea of journalists in some ways being the shadow side of the detective. They do the dirty work, they don't get paid, they risk their lives. And most of these stories, if I were talking about my personal life, most of these stories were written first as journalistic pieces for magazines or newspapers. And at some point when I was writing and doing the investigation for these pieces, I realized that I either needed a large group of people investigating with me, because archives in Ecuador aren't, we don't have very good archives, and the ones we do have in some ways they're not totally suited for work that involves going in and out and just getting a piece of information. You have to stay in there and shift through papers and get full of dust and find things that don't have anything to do with what you're looking for, but that drives you somewhere else, and maybe you'll get the information you need from somewhere else. So what I found, for example, when I was investigating the story about the Galapagos, which is a true story, the Baroness existed. In some recounts, she was a spy for the Japanese. There were two different German families who were in the Galapagos at that time in an island called Floriana. And some of the things that I found were and it makes perfect sense historically, because there was a North American base in one of the islands in Baltra. And it had to do with the Galapagos being in a direct line, if you would go up from Japan directly to the Panama Canal, and then enter what would be considered US seas. So Ecuador had an important strategic position during the Second World War. So in some ways, Ecuador was at the center of a conflict that involved the whole world. When I was researching this, I found anecdotal information about the Baroness. Most of the information I found was about her lewd character, a film that had been made where she appeared in the nude. Captains passing through the Galapagos, getting in contact with her having problems with the people that lived in the same island that she did. So at some point, this happened in all the stories, most of the stories in Álbum de Familia. So I decided that all these stories would be better served as fiction pieces, because I could speculate on what I thought was a possibility in a multiverse of possibilities. I stuck with one of those possibilities, and then from there, I just started pulling the thread and discovering something that interested me, or something that I believed would shed some sort of light on what I was trying to say about Ecuador in that particular story. So there's that connection with journalism more than detective fiction, even though that I love reading it.
No, I can see that. And I think you have, in a way, you're showing, you mentioned the nuance of literature as compared to other art forms, let's say. And it definitely feels like several of these stories are showing like the B side of history, or the other nuanced side of a historical event. And I mean, you mentioned the Baroness, but there's the Lorena Bobbit kind of scandal, which was obviously very kind of binary and simplistic the way it was presented, and we get a very unique, different angle in your story. There's also the Summer Institute of Linguistics, right? This kind of, in a way, a macabre institution of because of how it ended up working out, but you provide a very human kind of take on it too, which works very nicely. And I actually wanted to ask you about that, because you know, you have these stories which are about characters, and they're well-defined characters, and they're morally complex. And in a way, this kind of moral ambiguity keeps us as readers intrigued and kind of on our toes. But on the other hand, these stories also seem to rely on the presence or the possibility of adventure, right? And there's this sense of kind of risk and danger kind of looming over the stories. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that often presented dichotomy that separates stories that focus on character versus stories that are more plot driven? And first of all, do you put any value in that distinction? And how do you think in terms of that distinction, what the stories of a family album are doing?
When I set out to write, I don't think in those terms at all. What I do try to do in each of the stories, because I find that to understand the characters and their complexities in those stories, they need to have a context. And the reader, and I'm always thinking at some point, if not when I start writing, yes, when I'm editing. I think I wrote Family Album in 4 months, but it took me 4 years to edit because I kept on coming back and seeing what needed to be explained more, what I could take out, what the reader could bring to the story. If I took something out or I left something in. So I fiddle with them a lot. But when I'm trying to tell these stories, I think both of these are like in a balance, the atmosphere and the characters. And because they're based on some event that did occur, I try to keep away from the main characters, and I have people who are talking about them or mentioning them or riffing off on what happened, but not necessarily putting myself in the head of someone who lived, but rather in fictitious characters I invent. In the case of the Lorena Bobbit story, I remember when it happened, in general, the light was very, like you were saying before, in black and white. There were no nuances to what had happened to Lorena Bobbit, what John Wayne Bobbitt represented in that whole story, in the trial that followed. And I think that an interesting about time is that it makes you, it shifts things and makes you see them differently. And when I wrote this story, almost 20 years had passed, and now almost 30 years have passed, and there's this new viewing of what had happened with Lorena Bobbit in a documentary that came out a few years ago. But when I wrote the story, I wanted to concentrate on the figure, in this sort of trickster figure, joker figure of John Wayne Bobbitt, of what he became after the whole trial and what had happened, and Lorena Bobbit disappeared from public view. And he became, as some of you might know, a porn star. Then he went to Las Vegas and became a preacher. And then in a weird turn of events, he started trying to get back to Lorena, who had tried to restart her life without his presence. So what I did is take that facet of his as a porn star and take him to Argentina, to an invented event in a hotel that was constructed in the time of Carlos Menem. When Menem was in power in Argentina, was the time of neoliberalism at its peak. There were buildings constructed, everything was shiny and gold and silver and glass, and money was put out everywhere. And all of a sudden, everybody wanted to be modern and contemporary and have vacations in Europe. And I don't know, it was a big shift of what had traditionally been a very open culture to the world. It suddenly became focused on money. And at that point, there was a cabaret that opened, and they had I went to this cabaret, and they had unicorn heads at the entrance of a hotel. And when I was imagining John Wayne Bobbitt going to Argentina, I imagined him going to some place like this hotel that I had seen, with unicorns in the walls. And then when I was writing the story, I'm very interested in Latin American film. I did my dissertation on Ecuadorian film in particular. But when I was researching the movies that were shot in Ecuador in the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of co-productions with Argentina and Mexico especially. And all these movies were adventure flicks, they were soft porn, they were beach movies. And one of them was with a cabaret singer, a famous woman who was called Libertad Leblanc, who had her nemesis, to put it in very general terms, in Argentinian cinema, was Isabel Sarli. Isabel Sarli was larger than life figure. She did the first nude in all of South America. She worked with her husband. And at the time that she was making the movies with Bo, it was also the time of the dictatorship in Argentina. And there was a lot of censorship in film. So at some point, because she made these movies that had a lot of nudes, the Catholic Church was involved in censoring some of the takes. So at some point in each movie, there would be a lot of cutting up, and they would give her producer whatever was cut from the film. And in the early 2000s, film critic from Argentina went to interview her because he was writing a book about her. And she gave him all these stills that had been cut from her movies, and he made a documentary out of them. And it's the wildest documentary you can imagine, because it's pieces of film that were shot and completely taken out of the movies, and the movies didn't have any logical between one scene and the next, because they were low-cost productions, and they didn't have money to film and try to make the connection between what was cut out and what was filmed before and after. So that didn't matter too much at the time, because people went to see Sarli and that didn't worry too much about the plots. But when this man made the documentary, there were tons of scenes, because she had made tons of movies, where there was some violence that was happening to her in a movie, and that was cut out. So this movie had 1 or 2 or 3 instances where they were not general, but very close-up shots of penises. So the idea was that John Wayne Bobbitt would see something that had happened to him in a movie, and somebody would rescue him. And it was just a way of trying to understand what's in the head of a person that does what he did, of what film does in the representation of reality, of who goes to film theaters, of how film is constructed, how a culture is constructed. And I was trying in all these stories, and especially on this one, to play with dark humor. I was trying to bring in laughter to break a little of all that was presented at the time as abuse and sexual abuse and violence against this woman. So that's specifically on that story about John Wayne Bobbitt. That's called Honeymoon, because all the stories have a title that has to do with what one would imagine is included in a family album, a photograph, a family album. You put it a little higher up.
Oh, is it a little? Yeah, well, you start with baptism and yeah.
So there's a costume party, there's baptism, there's a family outing, there's the marriage, there's the costume party, the summer vacation. So there are 8 stories, and in some ways all of them play with the idea of humor and the way that humor can let you see a different part of a story that supposedly you know completely.
And I think it speaks to the great translation that humor is kept and works, you know, in this new version, because I remember that, and it's like refreshing pinceladas or brushstrokes throughout the stories. And I was thinking, I mean, one thing that runs through it is humor, and another thing is that I noticed is that 7 of those 8 stories are told in the first person, right? Except School Trip, I think they're all in the first person. So I was wondering first if that was a deliberate decision, but even more importantly, you can see that voice is very important in these stories. And I wanted to ask you how you go about kind of conjuring up these first person narrators and thinking of voice. Was the voice there, or is it there in the beginning? Is it a kind of origin, or is it a voice that is kind of a vehicle or a way of getting these to create these characters and create and transmit these fantastic scenes that you have in the stories?
But first, I'd just like to mention the translation. Mary Ellen Fayweger and Dick Cluster did an incredible job. It's also interesting that Mary Ellen Fayweger translated the stories just when they came out in Spanish. She translated Baptism and Marriage in 10 years ago. And then Dick has been translating the rest of the stories for the past 3-4 years. And then we've been doing a lot of back and forth, mostly with Dick, so that the melody that's in the Spanish would also be present in the English, and that the jokes wouldn't be lost, and that there'd be a sort of a context that somebody who wasn't from Ecuador could understand, that the jokes would still work. So that was a lot of fun. The first person, I think I need to hear the voice in my head. Dick would tell me that sometimes when we were going back and forth, that for him it was a challenge in some ways, because when he starts translating a book, he gets one voice and then he goes with it for 100, 200 pages. And each time in this book, in those 6 stories that he translated, after 8 or 10 pages of this dense material that could be read pretty quickly, but it has layers if you want to go in there, each had a very distinct voice. And it followed certain tropes that had to do with adventure or with thrillers or with detective or with dark humor. So each time he had sort of had to sit back, read, and understand that it was a different voice coming from somewhere else. It was mostly sitting down and thinking where I wanted to tell these stories from. When I was telling the story of the missionaries, I knew that I was going to tell it through the voice of someone who appears in the Amazon jungle, the Ecuadorian Amazon jungle, without knowing anything about Ecuador, someone who's trying to flee from a past that is following him. And I also wanted to establish a connection with New Orleans. That's a city that I love. And he's coming from Louisiana. And there was the connection with the oil rigs in Louisiana, so it could be easily translated to Ecuador. And this man was a very unstable character, someone you couldn't trust, whose voice you couldn't trust, and who in some strange, complicated way was more of an ally to the people living in the jungle than to the missionaries who are there to convert them. So everything was complicated and it had nuances. But that voice appeared in my head when I met a man that's friends with Mary Ellen Fayweger, who arrived in Ecuador in the 70s, and he has a hostel in a part of Ecuador that's a cloud forest, and he protects the land so because there's copper and gold in the land, and he doesn't want it to be exploited, so it's become a natural reserve. And one time I went to visit with Mary Ellen and I met him, and he told me that when he arrived in the 1970s, there were all types of very unsavory characters that he met from the US who were either fleeing the Vietnam War, who were fleeing the police, or who were trying to find a new life in a different country. So, and then he told some anecdotes which stuck in my mind. And when I decided to tell the story, I decided that that was the voice I wanted to tell the story, because I also wanted to think through the tropes of how you create nature. So I went back to Heart of Darkness. I went back to Humboldt. I went back to Darwin. And as beautifully as they write, they turn nature into this looming presence that's always out to get you. And that's the Western view of a jungle. The Waurani who are in the story, it's their home. They have no looming sense of anything. But I wanted to tell it through that eye because it created this atmosphere of something's going to happen, and it does. And it's based on something that actually did happen and appeared in Life magazine and became the news of a whole year in media in the US, and was hardly talked about in Ecuador because the news didn't come out. There was no state presence in the Amazon at that point. And when the military came, it was the US military who came in from Panama in helicopters to see what had happened to these missionaries who weren't responding in their airplane, their radio. So by writing this and by writing it from that point of view, I think I created the possibility of a reader understanding all these power dynamics, all this that had to do with the arrival of or the discovery of oil, that was very tied up with the beginnings of missions, Protestant missions, evangelical missions into the jungle in Ecuador, and eventually to other parts of the country, and not only the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned von Humboldt, and I think he is mentioned also in the book, one of the stories as well. And there is this sense of these characters charting kind of an uncharted path, but unlike von Humboldt, or let's say not arrogance, but the confidence of von Humboldt, these characters are more kind of trying to find their way and often not finding them. And I think the humor comes a lot from that, also from the kind of clash of expectations and context that don't seem to fit with each other often. And I mean, I was thinking it's not only a book about stories, but I think it's also, Family Album is a book about storytelling, right? And what it means to tell stories. And you have this story, you mentioned the Baroness story, Summer Vacation, where you have this writer / journalist trying to think about all the different ways of narrating this very unique and extravagant character in Ecuador. And that deals directly with how we tell and how we think about stories and why we tell them, but all of them have this element of someone telling a story. And I was wondering why is the act of storytelling, not just the story, but the act of storytelling, important to you and present kind of throughout? That's also like, it has a family air, the whole book, and this is one of the elements I think that runs across it.
It's not something I thought of when I was writing it, but I think now that I've been talking about the book because of the translation and going back to it, I think there's a direct connection with my childhood and my love of listening to my grandmother and my mother tell stories. They were just great storytellers, and I would be enchanted by the rhythm they put into their words, by the stories they were telling, by how fantastical the things they were saying, and to them seemed so normal. And I love for them to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it, because in each telling, something new appeared. And then there's that element, but there's also the element that's also connected to my family on the other side, on my father's side. My grandfather was a writer, and his life was full of books and dictionaries and a more formal way of telling stories also. So I think in some ways I was trying very unconsciously to mesh these two worlds together in this book. All this oral tradition coming down from my mom's mom, and this written tradition handed down from my grandfather. And then the love that I've always had of stories, either in oral form or in written form. I've done a lot of traveling in my life, and I remember like a source of comfort and feeling that I had something with me that I could carry around was carrying my favorite books around. Because I could go somewhere else, I could go to a different language, I could go to a different city, I could not know anyone apart from my family, but I would also have these books that connected me to a part that I knew was mine in some weird way. And I think there's also that idea of how reality is constructed through words and through stories. And lately, I'm thinking more and more of how we have to construct other ways of seeing the world, of seeing reality, because if not, we're just sucked into a hole, and we don't have the possibility of even walking or thinking something different, because we're fed through the media, through our phones, through everything that's we are connected to all the time, that is telling us how to think and what to think. And I think literature, because of it being complex, because of the possibility of not being black and white, because of the possibility of carrying it around and reading it when you were 8 or when you were 12, and then later at 30, and then at 40, you read something completely different because you see different things. And I think that if we stand the chance of what's coming in the future is if we fuel our imagination more. And if we connect through imaginations of thinking of different worlds and possibilities, and I don't think it's being naive or overly optimistic. I think we create life through stories and through communal stories of being together, of trying to do things together. So I think that's why I keep on writing. That's why I'm so overjoyed that City Lights is publishing this book, because of all the tradition City Lights books are connected to. And also because of all the translations they've been publishing since the 60s and their connection with poetry. Because that's something that also appears in the books, I think, is not poetry directly, but there is a sense of musicality of the words and how they're set on the page. And I think that sound and that rhythm has to do with the oral narrative of some sort of hypnotic way of imagining. And it's not only the person telling the story, but the people listening to the story.
No, that I really like you saying that, because I think, I mean, like the book packs a punch in that there is a thread running through it, but as we mentioned before, each story is also its own kind of unique, distinct universe. You get a lot in this kind of set of worlds, but because of these first-person narrators and because of this rhythm and cadence and kind of poetry in the language that you mentioned, I think it's also kind of comforting in a way, despite being these very distant and sometimes disconcerting worlds. There's a comfort in hearing the voice of the narrator tell you and kind of pull you through it. And I think that texture of it, it's a very unique and special element of the stories. And I think it's also, this is a good segue, thinking about how those cadences and rhythms translate into English. Perhaps you want to read a little bit of one of your stories? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll read just the beginning of Baptism, which is the first story.
Wonderful.
All the tables at the bar are full, as usual, but the staff, instead of waiting on the customers, is huddled in a corner. Even the owner is there. I once heard his wife question the wisdom of that lack of interest in the clientele. Where else are they gonna go, he said, without a trace of sarcasm. So she shrugged and went on talking with her friends. That's when my notions about the ways of the world switched into reverse. It's true, this is the only bar on the island. I couldn't join them because I was working the cash register that night, but I could hear them talking about the afternoon's waves. Most of the people who work here are surfers. The guy they called El Cojo, the crip, was at La Loberia. The rest went to Hola Carola. From what I gathered, El Cojo had better luck. He caught the perfect wave, but nobody believed him. The staff tend to be skeptical. Too many people pass through here and we're in the Galápagos. Everybody thinks that they have the right to claim they saw a shark. They grabbed the dolphin by the fin. They swam with 7 sea lions. Nobody believes them. Everybody believes them. It cancels out. To a certain extent, it's all a matter of perspective and ambition. My colleagues don't stray from 3 points on the island: Playa Man, La Loberia, and Hola Carola. The wildest thing you're likely to see there is a German tourist lying topless on the beach. Life is too short to miss the perfect wave, and those are the only places you'll find one. Why go anywhere else? They know what they want and they go after it. I envy them. Once I read that the only way to be happy is to be satisfied with what you have. I work with a group of laid-back guys who only care about waves. That's why they're skeptical. I'm not a skeptic, but I'm also not happy. I want. Sometimes I don't even know what I want. 80 years ago, right after arriving in San Cristobal, I worked in the galley on a boat that sailed around the archipelago. close to Wolf Island, with my head underwater, wearing a face mask and a snorkel, I saw 2 mating stingrays more than 6 feet long, 7 humpbacked whales, and hundreds of sharks swimming 90 feet below me. I like to listen, and I tend to keep quiet, or at least I try to, but sometimes I can't. Sometimes I talk too much. That's Robinson Crusoe's map, I say. The man turns and looks over his shoulder. What? He yells. That's the map of Alexander Selkirk, made of the archipelago. I walk over to his table and put my hand on the map he spread out. He widens his eyes and stretches his neck. He's got some kind of a gadget behind his ear. He looks like a turtle. His skin sags and folds as he leans over the tablecloth. There's a cataract on his right eye. He looks at me searchingly. He wants me to keep talking, a sign I've already said too much. I ask if he wants another drink. He shakes his head, points to the chair next to him. I sit. This guy didn't come on a tour. If he had, the bus would have been parked around the corner, and he doesn't seem like the tourists who stay at the boarding houses in town. He must have a boat anchored in the bay. He offers to buy me a drink. His Spanish isn't bad. What do you know about Robinson Crusoe? He asks after I have a gin and tonic in front of me. That wasn't his name, he smiles. And what else, he asks. That he came to the Galápagos under orders from Captain Woodes Rogers, that he was a pirate, that he was with Dampier when they attacked Guayaquil, that his boat sank near here, I say, full of gold. When he smiles again, the old man displays a set of perfect dentures. That's what they say. Somebody at another table calls to me. I ignore him. You don't believe it? He asks. I believe a lot of things. That doesn't mean they're true, I reply. In fact, Selkirk is one of my favorite subjects. I've read his diary. I know his story backwards and forwards. I'm convinced we would have been friends if I had been born in the 18th century. I wouldn't have thought twice about hanging out with him to soak up some of his knowledge. The guy knew what he wanted. There aren't many people who do and then act on it. He asked to be left behind on an abandoned island because the ship's captain was planning to risk going around Cape Horn in a leaky boat. He survived for 4 miserable years, but he was luckier than his shipmates who all died. The old man and I don't talk about that. We keep speculating about the fate of the ship that went down somewhere in the Galapagos. But when the customers start whistling, I have to leave him. The man, his name is Max, stays until closing.
Wonderful. That's I was noticing the description of Max there as a turtle-like character, and I know that at the end there was this kind of transcendental experience between Max and the turtle as well. And these characters like Max, I think very unique characters, kind of populate some of the stories, and they are a kind of endearing, but I also feel there's a wry smile from the narrator as he or she is looking at what's going on with these characters. And I wonder, there's like, these are stories which often deal directly with political issues and political conflicts, but there's also a different kind of political thread running through these stories that interested me. And I think it has to do with this soft kind of ironic smile that some of the narrators have, and often the ways in which they perceive others who are somewhere to discover, right? The sense of discovery that others assume, especially coming into Ecuador to do this. And you see this with the sunken treasure here in baptism. You see this desire to discover, the missionaries want to discover the uncontacted peoples of the Amazon, right? And it's all these kind of like not so great grandchildren of von Humboldt, precisely, right? And I wanted to ask you, I mean, hearing this and thinking about this more broadly, hearing you read, like, how do you write through these dynamics? Like, there's a soft satire, I feel, running through these texts. There's a satirical bent, but it's also challenging. There's possibilities, but it's also challenging. to have these characters who have a satirical bent and a wry smile, while at the same time seducing the reader. And I was wondering how kind of you made that happen. I don't know, that's probably not an easy question because some of these things just happen, as we know. But were you aware of that satirical bent and that political kind of potential of these narrators as they were kind of describing a scene and these kind of unique encounters?
Probably in the first writing, that wasn't that much there, but it came later with the editing process. But there must have been a trace of that, so I could build on it. And I suppose it has to do with the idea that's been very prevalent in these past few years with everything that's happening in the world with climate change and the need to change from oil to some other form of energy, and the discovery of gold and copper in Ecuador, and that becoming a very big problem at the present moment. Actually, there's going to be a vote in Quito, in the capital, if we want there to be mines exploited. There's going to be a referendum. And usually there's some very well-intentioned foreigners who come to tell us about what we should be doing to save the world. Usually people from Canada or Norway who have these very ecologically thoughtful governments in their own countries. But when they come to Latin America or Africa or Asia, their stance is very different. Most of the mining companies in the Southern Cone that have done great damage in Peru and Chile and Argentina are from Norway or from Canada. But so there's this double discourse of telling us that we don't know what to do, that we need to do certain things to save the planet, while at the same time, there's millions poured into exploiting the land and then leaving it behind, which is what happened with the oil in the 1960s and 70s with Texaco, which later turned into Chevron, and they left pools of oil seeping in the jungle, and there's innumerable cases of cancer. There's been a trial led by Fajardo in the Amazon region. He won, and now Chevron is suing back, so they don't have to pay the people that were affected by this oil spills. So there's this thing that was always in the back of my mind of well-intentioned people telling you what to do because they know better, because they're from more modern societies, because they're from richer countries, because they have more knowledge. And it's also interesting when Europeans still to this day come to Latin America, and they come with all of this civilization to explain to us poor savages how we should do things, when it wasn't more than 50 or 60 years ago that there was a world war and that things are starting to turn sour in that continent again, and that we're all in it together. It's not Europe and Latin America and Africa, and we're all in it together, and nobody has more knowledge than people who are working in communities or working in grassroots organizations. So this whole idea of somebody coming to tell you of all these NGOs that have good intentions, with no doubt, but or the Peace Corps who would send people in to explain to Ecuadorian farmers how to farm, and who would fail in many attempts because they didn't know the land, because they didn't know the soil, because they didn't know the customs. So I think that was always in there as a way of having that wry smile you were mentioning, that nobody knows. We have to figure it out. And we have to listen to the people who were already there. Nobody came to discover something that was empty or that wasn't populated. And that keeps on happening, even though we're all living right now because of globalization in about the same time zones, in about the same culture. And thankfully, there's still different languages and there's still different cultures to be listened to. So I think that's behind all the stories, this idea that we have to listen, and we usually don't listen, and especially people who have a pre-conditioned idea of the place they're going to. Mm-hmm. They listen much less than people who just arrive and discover what's there. And that's one of the later on in that story I was reading, there's a descendant of one of the kings of England who comes to look for this treasure. And he's convinced he knows everything because he's got all the money in the world to spend looking for this treasure. And at some point he just becomes bored and leaves. So there's this whole idea of what boredom means, what knowledge means, what knowledge from a different place means, what knowledge from the place where you're in means. And I think all of that is present all the time in tension inside the stories.
Yeah, and almost like this, I feel this kind of underlying notion that nature is always culture before it is nature. There is a healthy kind of, subtle skepticism at work in the stories. And it's funny you mentioned the Canadians, because in Guatemala, one of the worst mining projects was also Canadian. And these Canadians are, they're great, very nice people.
Yeah, I mean, it's nothing against the country or the people. It's against clearly the corporations that go to Latin America and have money and have investors and can do what they try to do.
Yeah, it's disconcerting. But anyway, I know we're kind of wrapping up with time. I just want to say, I mean, it's been great hearing you talk about the book, and it's been obviously fantastic reading this book. Great narrative tension, all these kind of dimensions to each story, self-contained universes that are like connected in subtle, interesting ways. And so, no, it's been a pleasure, Gabriela, as always. And I hope we do this soon in person, hopefully.
Yeah, it's been great, Rodrigo. And you always have a way of thinking of the stories that I usually don't think of when I'm writing, but when you mention them, you open windows to what's going on in there. So thanks.
Oh, wonderful.
Thank you both. That was great. Thank you, Rodrigo, for doing that. And thank you, Gabriella. We'd love to see you both at Powell sometime in the future. I hope that happens. Thanks everyone for joining us as well. And that was such a pleasure. Please consider buying a copy of Family Album. That would be great. We, of course, would love it if you bought a copy from powells.com. While you're there, you can pick up other books too, and you can also see our upcoming list of events. And we hope to see you all at events in the future. Until then, thanks, Gabriella. Thanks, Rodrigo. That was wonderful. And see you next time. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Adios.
Bye.